Hi, viewers. Today we have a very special guest. One of my friends from high school is joining us, and she's very passionate about human rights, especially LGBTQ. And so, Athena, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Athena Hauk. I'm an associate professor at Bryan and Stratton College, and I also help run a cultural consulting firm called Hathaway and Hauk Consulting. We mostly focus on making the workplace more trans inclusive.
Great. So, what do you think are the biggest challenges when it comes to transgender rights?
I think one of the biggest things is just the lack of education. There are so many people that I've met that don't particularly understand what the concept is, and also just don't sort of understand that there's a lot more beyond just the binary ID. I think a
Mhm.
lot of people are exposed to the binary idea of like trans men and trans women, but aren't really as familiar with the idea of non-binary people, and also usually aren't aware of the fact that everyone's transition looks different. I think there's an idea with most people that they sort of expect everyone to have like the same steps in their transition, and sometimes they'll ask you really weird questions that maybe they shouldn't be asking.
Mhm. So, with the program that you work with, what do you do to encourage education, or is there materials that you encourage people to read?
Yeah, so in addition to the presentation that we give, so essentially when you hire us, we're hired to do a presentation, and during that presentation, it sort of incorporates what we like to call Trans 101, which is a basic rundown of terminology, history, and sort of cultural presence of trans people throughout the last maybe 100 years or so. And then we'll usually talk about any specific state legislations. Like in New York State, we have gender. Not every state has that. So specifically, New York State has some more nuances with how you have to navigate that in the workplace. And we'll usually also discuss sort of just how to make your we do businesses, nonprofits, and also educational organizations. Pretty much just how to make any organization not only be more inclusive towards their clients, but also internally. So we talk a lot about database management, personnel file management, all that kind of stuff. We do have a literature list. So there are some books that are really important, like the book He, She, They, Us, which is a really short informational text that sort of has a lot of those terms that we talk about all in one place, as well as some more context given by, I don't remember what her name is, but the woman who wrote it is a professor at University of Austin. So it's like a pretty reputable source. There's also a couple of other books that are sort of like that, like the ABCs of LGBTQ plus. And then we also recommend too some more personalized books, like Whipping Girl is a memoir that's also an examination of like what it culturally means to be trans. So books like that.
Great. Great. So, what do you think society can do to help those who are in their transition process, already done with their transition process, or on the verge of starting their transition process?
The biggest thing is just it's hard because there's a fair amount of things, but I think the biggest thing is just not challenging people when they come to you with an identity. Specifically, like you don't see a lot of trans people in traditional fields, which is really unfortunate, unless they're a lot older. Because the issue is, if you're somebody who is applying for a job and you're young and you're transitioning and you're just coming out, there are unfortunately a lot of jobs that, even though it's illegal, will still kind of pass you over for other candidates that are cis. Like specifically, I am the only trans femme professor that I've met. And it was not an easy road. I've actually been fired from a college already, like for transphobia, because I had a very old department. Like most of my department was older. It was a Catholic school. Most of my department was older Catholic ministers who didn't realize that they were hiring a trans woman at the time. And then I got there and they were like, oh no. Um, and I also had an issue even finishing my degree. I had a school that I student taught at that it was very, very early on in my transition. I was on hormones and I had some issues with hiding the changes of hormones, and the fact that like hiding those changes was actually putting me in like a physical disadvantage because I would have to bind my chest. And it got to a point where it was so bad where I couldn't finish a lecture without having to go to the bathroom and like take that off so I could breathe. And I tried to come out and they were like, well, your options are you can either, come out and not teach here, or you can stay quiet and finish your teaching here, which is absolutely illegal, but I didn't know that at the time. Um, but just a lot of things like that where I find that a lot of people sort of get challenged for their identity, and they're like, "Oh, you really sure? Like, do you really want to do this?" And I think just sort of taking people at their word for it and just mostly asking like, "What can I do to support you?" instead of asking a bunch of invasive questions or just shutting it down.
Yeah. No, I worked for New York State this past summer in the Division of Human Rights, and I definitely saw a lot of cases with employers discriminating against those who have come out or are in the process of transitioning. And it's awful what they put these individuals through, when they're trying to, handle the, stress of it in itself, and then have, people, discriminating against them in the workplace as well.
Yeah.
Um, so with the new administration, obviously Trump tried to discourage against transgender rights and the LGBTQ community. What do you hope comes from the Biden-Harris administration? Any like particular areas that you think they should address um, with the next presidential term?
Yeah, so there's two that I've really been thinking about for a little while. Specifically, so New York State has a pretty solid blanket discrimination law. Basically, if you're in New York State, you can't discriminate against someone for housing purposes, education, healthcare, and workplace for a bunch of different protected categories across the board, including gender identity. And I really hope that something like that is implemented across the country because there are so many states that specifically have laws that actually counteract that idea. Idaho specifically is a right to work state, meaning that like if they don't like something about you, they can absolutely fire you without a real reason. And I know this because my partner is from Idaho and she's been fired from 4 jobs for being trans because customers had complained that she was transgender. So I would like to see something similar to that sort of be at a national level. And the other thing is, I would love to see a national ruling on what's considered trans panic or gay panic. Are you familiar with the terms?
No, I haven't heard of that before. What is it about?
Trans panic or gay panic, they're very similar terms, but basically the idea is that it's a legal defense used by people who murder people from the LGBTQ community. And it's a defense that claims like temporary insanity. Basically, it's a way to excuse a hate crime. The most typical, like the most common scenario with it, with gay and trans people are maybe they're out at a bar and somebody stalks them on their way home and kills them. Using that defense in court, you can actually just sort of get away with murdering people. And the other way that that usually comes up too is with trans women specifically. Like if somebody like takes a trans woman home and they have relations, and suddenly like this is a situation that happens a lot. The person who took them home is suddenly overwhelmed with like guilt and rage because they're internalized transphobia and homophobia, and they murder that person. That's also another instance where they can use the trans panic defense and sort of not have any charges levied against them. And that's currently still legal in 43 states as of 2020. I think there are 7 states specifically that have outlawed it, and 3 states that are considering outlawing it, but considering that they've usually been thinking about it for at least 5 to 7 years, I don't think it's happening. So
Yeah.
something to address that nationwide would be incredible.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lack of push, at least with the past 4 years. But I mean, it needs to be a national, movement to, protect anyone. And obviously, we're lacking in that area, which is disappointing. Um, I'm someone I promote, equality for everyone, and seeing that people are still discriminated against for any reason is defeating. Well, is there anything else you want to share or mention before we end?
Not really. I guess maybe just the parting thing is like if people tell you that they're transitioning, don't ask a lot of questions. Like if people are comfortable with talking about those things, they'll volunteer that information.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Thank you so
Okay.
much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate that and everything that you're doing with the company that you're working with. I think it's really great that you guys are, encouraging, workplace equality. And yeah.